Sir Fazle, I want to start with you. As I was saying backstage, I last saw you in Des Moines when we were both at the World Food Prize a few months ago. And I'm so grateful that you came so far to be with us this afternoon. While I know the story of BRAC well, everyone here may not. And particularly as we're going to talk about how we ensure that refugees have opportunities to live dignified and safe, meaningful lives. And that was a core part of why you started BRAC in the early 1970s in Bangladesh. Could you share a little bit about the founding of BRAC, the evolution of BRAC, and kind of what you think we all should know as we think about the greatest refugee crisis in our world since the Second World War?
Well, thank you. Briefly, in 1971, I was a refugee myself. I had fled East Pakistan, fearing for my life. And the relatives and friends I left behind, particularly one of my closest, my dearest uncle, a mentor to me, he was also arrested and killed. So I feel a great deal of empathy with the refugees today. But then in 1972, I came back to the independent Bangladesh, and then 10 million refugees were coming back from India. Bangladesh was in ruins. What people left behind, homes, farm tools, utensils, livestock, everything was destroyed or looted. So Bangladesh was in real trouble. So we started work. I sold my apartment in London, and with that money I started a relief organization. Then I raised more money for relief. But then I thought that relief is not going to be the real answer to the problems of development and for the people, for uplifting people out of poverty. So what was needed was holistic, long-term development. So we started working on agriculture, on fisheries, on livestock, on financial services, family planning, health, all kinds of education of children, literacy for adults, and all kinds of programs. And but then what was the problem at that time was people's one of the biggest enemies at that time was people's sense of fatalism. There was a kind of feeling that poverty, disease, hunger is essential part of life, and as inevitable as the sun and the rain. So trying to get this attitude changed was the essential thing. And we decided to get groups of men and women work and discussing with them in their villages the problems of rural life, their poverty, and how to surmount those. And then it started, various kinds of ideas started floating, coming in. And then also what happened is that things like hope started to emerge also. So these are important things. Hope is one of the most important things in a country in crisis. And when people have hope, you have, they can take action. And that's what we were looking for. And that's what we could get, and people started taking action to change their lives. So that's how programs started in Bangladesh, and we went about changing people's lives over the next 40 years. I've tried to work in Bangladesh and trying to get at least the people come out of extreme poverty and living a more meaningful existence.
And you do so much more now, even beyond Bangladesh, so you're kind of being too immodest for the work that BRAC has done, both in your country and now around the world. Carolyn, we know that a majority of refugees and internally displaced persons are women and children. You know, some estimates put the percentage as high as 75, possibly even 80% of Syrian refugees are women and children. Kind of building on what Sir Fazle was talking about, how do you think about kind of the holistic suite of services that Save the Children tries to provide to children and their families, with also the essential ingredient of hope?
Sure, well, thank you. And I do just have to say thank you for allowing me to sit on the same stage with the hero of mine. He's done more to empower poor people around the world than I think anybody has, so it's really an honor. You know, Save the Children's been working on the issues for Syrian refugees for now almost 5 years, sadly. I wish I didn't have to say that, but I do. And we really, it's about 50% of those refugees that are actually under the age of 18. And then, as you said, quite a large percentage that are women. So our work is in kind of 3 circles, I guess, if you will, at this point in time. And it's kind of these ever-expanding circles. One circle is inside Syria. So actually working inside, probably some of the most dangerous work I think our teams are doing. Very basic things at this point, because unfortunately the health system is in ruins, the school system is in ruins, so we're doing very basic things like vaccinating children against polio in a country that hadn't had a polio case for many, many years, trying to get kids into school in a situation where the schools are continually being bombed. So really basic things inside Syria, as I said, really dangerous, great risk to our teams there. And then in the 5 countries surrounding Syria, really working to try to, and we were talking about this earlier, to try to provide basic services to the 4 million refugees that are in the 5 surrounding countries around Syria. Things like education, which I think is a huge, huge issue right now. If I was just in Greece a couple weeks or a couple months ago, sitting and talking to families, and when you sit and you talk with a family who had just left Syria, and I say to them, why now? Why are you leaving now? They say, or from one of the surrounding countries, they say, you know, I can't sit here anymore and watch my children not be in school for another year, after 2 years, 3 years. All of us who are parents would do exactly the same thing. We'd get on that boat. We would get on that trail, and we would do the same exact thing. So we have got to give a future to people who are living in those surrounding countries, whether they're in a refugee camp or whether they're living in a tent by the side of the road. So education and health services, and particularly a big, big focus on education. And then in the last year, our programs have expanded to now children and families on the move. So those that have decided they will leave, and so we're working in Greece on the island of Lesbos with thousands and thousands. There's more than 100,000 people who have been through that island just in the last few months, feeding people every day, trying to give them some basic support, helping them on the way. Serbia, Macedonia, and then in the countries where people are eventually going, so Germany, Norway, and Sweden are 3 of the large ones. And you know, probably one of the saddest things that I heard when I was talking with families is I talked to a little boy who was on his way to Germany, and I said to him, you know, what are you looking forward to? And I thought he'd say, you know, playing or going back to school or something. He said, I just want to go to a place where I'm going to be safe. It's as basic as that. And so those are the kinds of things that we're doing, and many other organizations are working alongside us, a lot of UN organizations, a lot of NGOs, just to try to make people's lives a little bit better. And I know we'll get to some of the bigger solutions that we have to get to.
So I think, you know, now pivoting to solutions, although I would argue that both of you and your organizations are clearly kind of in the vanguard of always learning about what works and candidly what doesn't work, and kind of how we do more of the former and less of the latter, and how we look for partners to help strengthen that work and to amplify that work. Sir Fazle, could you talk a little bit about how you believe what you've done with BRAC can be applicable to the circles that we were just hearing articulated, kind of organize the work of Save the Children today? I mean, what do you think about what you can do can be translated, not dropped in, but translated to either work in Syria or work in the frontier countries, or work to help people who are still migrating, for whom the migration has not stopped?
Well, we have some experience of people coming back to their own country. Like Afghanistan, when in 2002, we had 4.5 million refugees coming back home. And I thought that it reminded me of the 1972 in Bangladesh. And we went there to start working with the refugees who are coming back home. But then I decided not to go into relief mode, go into long-term development mode. And so I started creating job opportunities, microfinance, healthcare, and education. I remember in Bangladesh we had provided education to more than 10 million children through a program which we had one teacher school, one with 30 children in a village. And we perfected that. Basically what we did is recruit a woman who is a housewife with high school education. We gave her a training and provided supervision and monthly refresher courses to upgrade her skills. And gradually she became a high quality teacher over time. So that model was transported into Afghanistan, and we educated nearly 420,000 girls in primary education. And we also trained large numbers of teachers in order to get government education services going. So I think one of the problems of refugees is that their children are not being educated. Most of them are being given a ration, but then without children being educated, without opportunities created, health services created in the refugee camps, this doesn't work. I think people continue to move. But what is really needed in the refugee camps, we need to create more opportunities in terms of educating children, in terms of creating more job opportunities for people, or even training for new kind of skills. These are needed to keep people where they are rather than trying to go to Europe to change, to look for more opportunities for themselves.
And do you think that there has been a paradigm shift kind of from thinking relief and development are two kind of separate and distinct modalities? And clearly what Sir Fazle realized a very long time ago now in Bangladesh is that we need to be clearly doing both simultaneously.
Right.
I think that's exactly right, and so much of the work that we do really kind of goes back and forth between that spectrum. I mean, you start with one, and then you kind of have to do crisis, and then you go back. Ethiopia is a great example of something that's happening actually right today, where we're going kind of back and forth with a huge drought that's going on there. But I think in the case of Syria, I mean, I do think education is a real key. And I think if you look at the humanitarian system overall, the percentage that gets spent in emergencies on education is tiny. It's between 10 and 20%. Mm-hmm. And that has to change, because particularly in this crisis, it is driving much of what's happening is being driven by the lack of education for kids. And when we think about the average for a refugee, the average is 17 years as a refugee.
And it's only going up.
That's a whole childhood right there. So if we are not really investing in these kids' education, and right now Syria's gone from being virtually 100% of kids in school-age children in school, to 50%. So what kind of a future are we going to be able to rebuild for that country if we don't turn that around?
And Carolyn, what do you think the right answers are? I mean, is it about augmenting the capacity in the school systems in the frontier and kind of ultimate recipient countries, I mean, in the way that Lebanon is now running 3 shifts of school, and there are now more Syrian students in the Lebanese public school system than there are Lebanese students in the Lebanese public school system? Is it building schools in refugee settlements? I mean, what is it kind of doing clearly what Sir Fazle's found to work in Bangladesh and Afghanistan and elsewhere where BRAC works, kind of training maybe mothers who have a sufficient level of education to become teachers? I mean, what do you think the right answers are?
Well, I think it's probably all of the above, unfortunately. I think, Lebanon is a good example where there are these shifts of schools now. Ultimately, keeping kids in those schools is going to prevent families from deciding that they have to leave. I think that's absolutely true. I do think thinking about whether refugees should be able to work or not is really a key question that we have to ask. If I look at what's happening to children, right now, many children are working. And that's another reason they're not in school. And they're working because their parents are not allowed to work. And somehow kids are kind of slipped under the wire and they're out working and they're making money for their families because they have to survive. But we've got to relook at what we think of as a refugee's life, I think. And I think this whole issue of work, not just when we ultimately a refugee gets to somewhere they're going, but again, if that's going to be 17 years of your life, we have to change, I think, the way we think about that and the ability of people to work, and everybody wants to. So,
Sir Fazle, what do you think about either the education question or the kind of right to work question? Because it really is a question about rights and how we kind of view the rights of refugees.
Well, refugees need to be rehabilitated in wherever they are. So we need to find ways of getting them, solving the problem where they are rather than where they are likely to go. So I think we need to tackle the problems of refugees in where they are, tackle the problem in refugee camps where they are, and provide opportunities as much as possible. Otherwise, it becomes a big problem for many countries.
And do you think, and Carolyn, you're probably a perfect person to ask this to, do you think perceptions around this question of right to work are shifting? Because we do have examples, tragic examples of what happens in the Dadaab refugee camp where people haven't been able to work for now 20 years, and then what people do find to occupy their time, or what is happening for so many of the Syrian refugees who do continue to move because they can't find work and they can't find educational opportunities. Do you think that's starting to then shift the kind of global norms around this question, but also for recipient countries who do host refugees shifting their kind of policies? Are we getting to that point, or are we still not there yet?
I think we're getting to that point, but I do think it's going to take, I think it's going to actually take more support, particularly for those countries where Syrian refugees are. And I think it's going to take kind of something in between a kind of total free market system for people to work and do whatever they can do, and some kind of supported system. Because obviously, in a lot of these countries, refugees are living in really poor areas where everybody is struggling, right? So the Jordanians are struggling, the Lebanese are struggling in those areas, the Iraqis are struggling, certainly where we have refugees. So I think there's going to be an interim, but I do think that there is probably more openness to that than maybe there ever has been before.
Whatever that interim might be. And,
I think more resources needs to be channeled to refugees. And that's one of the problems of refugees not having schooling for their children, opportunities, lacking of opportunities, healthcare and so on, was lack of funding. And suddenly Europeans are now coming up with more funding for Turkey and other people who are having lots of refugees. So this is a good sign that people are ready to look at the issues of education while in the refugee camps, provide better opportunities for refugees. And I think more resources would make it much better.
I've also been amazed at the resources that have become more available with the private sector. And I do think that that's changed. That's something we saw change kind of at the end of this year. And I actually just did a phone call this afternoon with Johnson & Johnson, who made a large gift to Save the Children for the refugee crisis, and they did it driven by their European employees. Their European employees said, we see what's happening, we see people coming, showing up on our doorstep, we see the situations that they're in. Isn't there something that we can do to help about this? So that has really changed, and I think that ability for people to say there is something that we can do, whether it's Johnson & Johnson, Google was another big supporter of Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders, IRC. You know, in 3 days, they raised 10 million euros online because people said there are things that we can do about this. So I think it's also tapping not just governments, and there was this big conference that happened today in London, and I think governments are stepping up, which is good, and education, I think, did get a lot of play at that conference, but also I think the private sector. There are things that the private sector can do and a difference that they can make, and I think that that is starting to, we saw that change kind of at the end of this past year.
So I think this is a question for both of you. Is it just a funding question, or is it still a solutions question? I mean, if there were unlimited funds, whatever that would mean, would you know how to deploy those in a way in which every child could be educated, every person could find some work or alternative means of dignified engagement, health services could be provided? Or is it still also an organizational challenge because we don't have enough teachers and we don't have enough healthcare workers on the front lines? I mean, and so could you talk a little bit about kind of how you think of each of those?
I think if resources are available, then frontline workers who could be mobilized. And I think what has been the problem with refugees was that the resources were not adequate to support them properly. In some cases, only food was provided, very little education, very little healthcare, very inadequate, living condition. So all kinds of problems because of lack of resources. If the resources are available, I'm sure that mobilization of whether it is governmental organization or non-governmental organization could be mobilized to provide the services if the resources are made available. So that's why I always considered that lack of resources for refugees was one of the big problems.
Carolyn, what do you think?
I do think resources would help, but I'll give you one example of where even if we had lots and lots more resources, I'm not sure we could solve the problem. And this is a big one for us, kids going on their own, unaccompanied children. So 26,000 unaccompanied children is the estimate of kids that are going across Europe right now. These are children under the age of 18. Many of them are 14, 15. And they're being sent on their own for the most part. Some of them have lost their families, and there you're trying to reunify them with their families. But a lot of them have been sent on their own by their families to try to get to Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, where there is family waiting. And that's a kind of a desperation move. And one of the things we find in working with those kids is they don't want to be identified. They don't want they want to try to get to where they're going, and they think that, by being part of some help that's going to get them there, that they may not get there. So that's an example of a really difficult cultural, behavioral, all sorts of things that are wrapped in there, which I'm not sure. Of course, if we had more resources, we could probably put more supports around those things. But there's something else there besides just that issue, and it points to, I think, how difficult this crisis, I think, can be.
So I realize we're running short on time, but I want to ask each of you a final question, which is really a reflective one. If resources are part of the challenge, but not the whole challenge, what could the CGI community best do to support your work? And the answer might just be more funding from more sources. More funding because clearly resources matter, more sources because hopefully it then creates more allies and partners for this effort, but also for those that you will need to be engaged in the future? Or are there functional or other kind of contributions that the CGI community could make to confronting our refugee crisis at this moment, while also kind of having an eye toward long-term development? If you want to answer that, maybe Carolyn, and then we can.
So I can give you one. I think resources from the group that's here are certainly important, but I'll give you one example where bringing the skills maybe of particularly the private sector can come to bear. So in Lesvos, where we're running this huge operation for, literally 5,000 people a day who are kind of going through these camps, one of the biggest needs there is for information. So refugees need to know, how do I get from here to the next place? What happens at the next place? What's the path that I need to take? And literally we have people kind of, at every point kind of telling people where to go. Everybody has a smartphone, or a cell phone at least. Being able to get that kind of information available for people in some kind of an app. So we've been working with Google on just that, so that there's an app where people can know that. It's just very basic things. The buses are over here to get you to the camp. Once you get to the camp, you can buy your ticket for the ferry to Athens over here. Here's what it costs. Here's what it's going to take. Here's how long it'll take you to do the registration. All those kinds of things. And rather than us hiring literally thousands of people to stand around and tell people this is what you do, put it on an app. So there's an example of bringing, and there are thousands of other examples where we need that kind of creativity. Some of these are logistical issues. They're issues of moving masses of people and getting safely, and those kinds of things. There's a lot of things that the private sector can do, in addition, obviously, to resources. And a lot of them, as I said, have given lots of resources, and we hope will continue to.
Sir
I won't say
Fazle?
anything.
You will say nothing. You just want to echo what Carolyn said.
It's difficult, yes. Echo.
Well, I think Sir Fazle's far too humble. And Carolyn said that she was sitting with one of her heroes. I'm certainly sitting with two of my heroes, and I just want to thank them for spending time with us today. I certainly hope that you will, and now I'm just once again going to be shameless. Some of you are going to write recommendations to the University of Rhode Island and Cornell. You laugh, but I'm quite serious if you have those connections. I hope that certainly some of you will contribute financially, but also functionally along the lines that would be helpful to Save the Children, and I have no doubt also equally helpful to BRAC and all of its important work around the world. I just want to thank all of you for joining us once again, and I hope that you will continue to let us know at CGI what more we can be doing to be supportive of the work that you're doing, whether that's making connections with likely or unlikely partners and allies or in other areas. I hope that today has been inspiring and catalytic. It certainly has been for me, and we're so grateful to have your engagement today. We also hope that we will have your feedback. Thank you all very, very much, and please thank Carolyn and Sir Fazle once again.